women feel safer on a bike than on foot or on the bus because you move faster, potentially. You feel like you have more freedom, more autonomy to get away from threatening situations. I remember a story told by a walking commissioner, and he was starting to plan routes. He had an idea for a route because it was away from motor traffic, and he having gone through this route with two women planners, and they both said, no, this route is terrible, we would not feel safe here after dark, and that influenced the way that cycle route was planned.
We talk about road accidents, but not the near misses that make people give up cycling. We talk about car bans, but not the data that reveals where walking and cycling could actually thrive. In today's episode of the Human City podcast, I speak with Dr. Rachel Aldred, Professor of Transport at the University of Westminster, whose groundbreaking research from the near miss study to the Propensity to Cycle tool and London's congestion charging insights is changing how cities measure risk, plan infrastructure, and decides whose streets are really built for. This episode is about shifting the lens from counting cars to counting people. So let's dive in. Hi Rachel, welcome to the Human City podcast. So Rachel, starting with a little personal note, what made you want to spend your life studying how people move through cities?
Sure. I think it was really during my PhD research where I was looking at health policy, but I was doing case study research in East London, which had been fairly extensively bombed during World War II and rebuilt with a flyover, large roundabout, and there were lots of major roads. There were also lots of rail lines. There was a canal. So there was a lot of transport infrastructure. And it really interested me walking around this area, how difficult it made it to get around on foot. So, for instance, if people lived in one of the local estates, one side of a major road, they had to go down through a subway, up a subway again to get to the shops. And it was really kind of, dark, a bit dirty, didn't feel entirely safe. And that was so that people who were driving through the area could be sped through as, efficiently, as quickly as possible. So I got really interested in some of these transport justice issues, as well as getting obviously a little frustrated myself as I was trying to get around the area. And I kind of increasingly thought this was something that I was interested in looking at. Plus, it was clear that there were connections to health that weren't really talked about that much. So in the local area, there were very high rates of childhood asthma. And one of the factors associated with that is higher levels of air pollution. And that would be associated with, the high levels of motor traffic going through the area. And at the same time, there was relatively low levels of car ownership in many of those estates. So yeah, that just kind of sparked my interest.
So you moved from sociology to transport. Why that shift? Is it only because of your personal experiences, or is it, that you thought sociology would bring that social factor in that?
Yeah, I mean, there was some research in sociology looking at transport, like the mobilities paradigm, with people like Mimi Scheller and John Urry, who had started to write on that. And I thought, that there was a lot of work that could potentially be done there. And I was increasingly getting interested in cycling as well as walking, and sort of the way in which on foot or on a bike, you see the city differently than if you're behind a windscreen. I also thought if I was going to do work in this area, it would be nice to be better connected to some of the transport planning people, because I didn't just want to kind of write theory in a vacuum. I wanted to be involved in influencing and influenced by some of the policy debates that were happening, which also were particularly interesting. And London was increasingly kind of doing things that interested me around transport policy.
You just mentioned that when you're cycling, you see the city differently, and when you're in the car, it's different. But do you think as a woman, you see city differently?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, it's kind of a complicated issue, and women are not one homogenous group. There's a lot of differences in terms of age, ethnicity, sexuality, the presentation, the size. A lot of things influence how people experience the world while cycling and how the world treats them as well. But certainly, one of the interesting things that women and people from marginalised groups will say that sexual harassment does happen when women are cycling. Some women feel safer on a bike than on foot or on the bus because you move faster, potentially. You feel like you have more freedom, more autonomy to get away from threatening situations, perhaps. And obviously that those threatening situations don't disappear. Then again, that has to be balanced. People have to balance that against the fact that in many contexts, cycling is a lot riskier regarding traffic than it should be. But on the other hand, interactions with motor vehicles are going to be potentially more threatening, more risky than they might be. I think it's quite it's quite an interesting topic, and experiences are quite complex and quite differentiated.
In your near miss project, women reported more scary incidents than men. So Could you reveal more about it, talk about the project itself?
Sure. So the Near Miss project was something that I was really interested to look into because certainly in terms of cycling, there was sort of a debate that was happening in the UK and I think in some other contexts as well about whether the cycling was objectively risky in terms of traffic or whether it was just that people thought it was risky. So kind of objective versus subjective. And people would quote statistics and sort of say, well, you would have to cycle for 8,000 years to be killed. So therefore it's safe. And then on the other hand, people would say, no, I don't feel safe enough to cycle. So it seemed like looking at near misses was perhaps a way through that because it could capture something about an experience of unsafety that was not about are you injured or not. It was actually about incidents that could be measured that didn't cause injury. And in the UK, we actually have quite good road injury data. We have, spatial data. We have data about the victim, data about other parties. But there was no data on near misses. And sort of anecdotally, people who cycled would be like, I experienced a lot of near misses. A driver cut me up, a car passed too close. And they would talk about these things, but there was no national study that measured the rate. I thought this would be super interesting and might be a missing link because ultimately maybe people are not coming home injured, but if they're coming home having been tailgated by a bus and thought that they were going to be hit, that is emotionally really quite distressing experience, and that might affect how safe they feel cycling is. And similarly, if you're walking along a street or even in a car, if you're there and you see a bus driver tailgate a cyclist, that will give you a sense of how safe cycling is as well. I thought these are things that could be measured. And so we recruited people who cycle to sign up to keep a record of trips and any near misses on a specific day in advance. So we had 1,500 people in the first year, and then it ran for another year, recording their trips and saying how many annoying or scary incidents they had, if any. And the answer was quite a lot. And it was certainly a lot more than injuries. And it really gave a sense of what the everyday experience of cycling is in the UK. Sadly, it's one that people might be experiencing every week, something that was really scary. And you think, if you're just trying to get to the shops, to work, see a friend, and yet there's that higher risk of being really scared, that is going to put people off. That is going to potentially mean that they don't do it anymore or they don't start doing it. And these are incidents that can be prevented potentially. So that was really important. And then, as you mentioned, we looked at different groups and their likelihood of experiencing near misses. And we did find that women had higher rates of near miss experience than men, and that seemed to be linked to, on average, differences in cycling speeds as well, that particularly men cyclists reduce their risk of near misses is by going faster and by keeping up with the traffic and by trying to go fast and get out of the way. And if for some people you can't do that or you're not comfortable doing that, perhaps women, older people, children, then you're potentially at a higher risk of a near miss. But it was worrying that they were even higher for women.
So when the study was out, did the government do any changes on the ground to reduce that risk? Was it taken at that level?
So it did get quite a lot of interest. It wasn't so much the national government, I think. It was more local government and local police services that reacted to it. So it encouraged Transport for London in London to incorporate subjective safety more into planning and into evaluating cycling environments. Subjective safety in terms of social safety, safety from harassment, but they also talked about people feeling intimidated by large vehicles, so that in their planning criteria it wasn't just risk of injury, it was how people might feel if they're forced to mix with buses. They're not going to feel safe, and even if the risk of injury is low, many people will not feel safe cycling with buses. They will experience potentially near misses and so on. So London, but also some police services started getting cyclists and other road users to report near misses in order to use that in planning. That data was used in different ways. So sometimes it was used in enforcement, so that if there was a particular road where drivers tended to overtake cyclists too closely, they would go out and do some operation and stop drivers and tell them that what they were doing was potentially an offence and that they needed to change their behaviour. Or it was used by transport planners, which is even better because then you're thinking about the road environment that is created and changing, which will also influence behaviour. So, for instance, if that road where drivers are overtaking cyclists is long and straight and the kind of width that drivers feel encouraged to overtake. So potentially if you change the road environment so that drivers have to slow down so that it's harder for them to overtake cyclists, you potentially give cyclists their own space so that they're more protected. That's something that can be done and doesn't rely on drivers changing their behaviour, which may go back to what it was when there's no kind of enforcement operation happening. There's been work on near misses in Canada and other countries, and I think there's a wider influence too. It's helped develop the debate around cycling, and that people need to feel safe as well as have a low injury risk. They need to also feel comfortable, which is, the case for people walking and using public transport too. We also need a train service that is, comfortable, affordable, safe, clean, and all those other things as well. So I think it moved that debate on the work.
That's interesting. So you also built a propensity to cycle tool where cities plan where cycling could really take off. Now that's very interesting. So could you really talk about that?
Yeah, this was a really nice project, the Propensity to Cycle Tool project. So it was led by Cambridge University. So it was a collaboration of 4 universities, and it was commissioned by the Department for Transport in the UK. So it was basically something that could then be used in planning, as you say, and it has been used by local authorities across England and Wales, which is where the tool covers. So basically what we were doing was using census data on travel to work is really spatially detailed. So you've got where people live and you've got where people go to work. So if they're going from the outskirts of town to the centre of town, if they're travelling 5 kilometres or 50 kilometres. So you've got a lot of information about those trips. And we also know what the main mode of travel is by distance. Is it train, car, bike, walk, or whatever. So we used that data to look at what trips might most easily be switched to cycling potentially. So largely that was based on distance and hilliness. So the model is based on the fact that a 5 kilometre trip is much more likely to be cycled than a 50 kilometre trip. We used something called distance decay curves to model the likelihood of trips of different distance being cycled, and we did the same for hilliness. So we had that for the English and Welsh situation, and we also could apply scenarios to that. So we did the same for the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, there's a lot more cycling than there is in England, but similarly, it's not evenly spread. It's like if it's a shorter trip, it's more likely to be cycled a longer trip. And we also used hilliness data from Switzerland because the Netherlands is less hilly. But basically, we had a Go Dutch scenario that basically said, okay, if people in England were as likely to cycle as people in the Netherlands based on trip distance and hilliness, not only just what would the headline levels of cycling be, but where would those cycling trips take place, which is really interesting. So basically, if England went Dutch and people started having Dutch propensities to cycle, that's probably assuming an awful lot better infrastructure and a cultural and policy change. Where would that happen? What towns, what routes even? Because we could map each origin destination pair to specific routes. We could say, what is the most likely route to cycle based on the route directness. And so we were then able to sort of look at hotspots around the country, which are the towns and the cities that would have really high cycling levels, and also within a town or city, which roads would have the most cycling if we achieved that scenario. So it helped planners think, if we get significantly more cycling, where will that happen? What routes should we prioritise to build infrastructure? And they could then use that in their planning processes. So the Go Dutch was one scenario, but we also had other scenarios, including one related to e-bikes, which assumed that there was much wider use of e-bikes, because in other European countries like Germany and the Netherlands, people make great use of e-bikes, and England has some quite rural and quite hilly parts, and we found that in those areas e-bikes potentially made a big difference. Somewhere like Cornwall in the southwest, because of its hilliness and the long trips, but when you add e-bikes, which enable people to cycle further and to cycle more hilly routes, then it could achieve really high levels as well. So that project also kind of kick-started a debate around e-bikes as well, and about the extent to which they would help, particularly some parts of England with longer journeys, with hillier terrain and so on. So it was a really interesting project, and we found that 80 odd local authorities in England were actually using the Propensity to Cycle tool to plan, and even though the tool is quite old now, it's still seen as important and quite innovative work.
So you mean that the Propensity to Cycle tool helps you improve the infrastructure? So that's what the local authorities are basically utilizing it for?
Yeah, exactly, because it says if cycling increases on road, roads. There are reasons why it might go up more in certain areas that have shorter trips that are currently not being cycled. So it can, if you're a local authority in England where cycle infrastructure is still quite poor, you might look at your town and think, there's a lot of infrastructure we need to build on all these main roads, but which should we do first? And the propensity to cycle tool can help sort of say, well, this one is a particularly important one. This one will facilitate a lot of trips that could be made, but that are not currently being made. So yeah, it's helpful in infrastructure planning. And I should also add, we also had data on school trips that was kind of similar. So we could also look at cycling potential for journeys to school. And that was quite interesting because that was quite a different pattern. So the journeys to work tended to be like radial. They go from the outskirts to the city centre. But journeys to school are really different because schools are not all in the city centre, they're dispersed. So looking at cycling potential, cycling to school really highlighted the importance of, building infrastructure in a more dispersed way as well, not just to get people into work. If you want to create good conditions for cycling to school, spatially, it looks quite different. And that's really important because in the UK, women make the overwhelming majority of trips to school with children as well. So if you're thinking about like gender differences and, increasing women's cycling, then, you've also definitely got to think about trips to school because women are making a lot of those trips with children.
So if, city or any country, city in India want to replicate the same tool in India, what kind of data would we require to create such a tool?
Yeah, so you basically need a lot of origin destination data, which I don't know if the census in India has that data or not, but basically that's what you would need, some kind of data across the population that has data on trip origins and trip destinations, which is what we had. So like for millions of people, we had where their home was and where their workplace was, and we were able to use that to estimate cycling potential.
Shani, you mentioned that you did a lot of comparison with the Dutch cities, but Dutch cities often get credit for being great for cycling because they benefit from controlled sprawl and smaller populations. But in fast-growing countries like India, where cities are denser and they have a lot of urban sprawl, what steps should government really take to make walking and cycling a priority?
Yes, I agree. The Indian context is quite different from the Dutch context, and I think considering like the UK as well, London is very different from the rest of the UK, and it's kind of interesting to see the changes in London because London is a megacity, obviously not among the biggest global megacities, but the story of London is quite interesting. It wasn't traditionally very high cycling. It was much more a public transport city. It was much more a commuter city and so on. And the fact that London has been able to increase cycling, I think is quite encouraging because in the UK, the more compact cities might be seen as more suitable for cycling, haven't necessarily got very high levels of cycling. Land use planning is clearly very important. And in London, there's quite a lot of land use regulations that I think have been quite helpful around limiting the amount of car parking that can be provided in new developments, incentivising developments that are in brownfield sites and that ideally are car-free or low car in many boroughs, not all boroughs. London's growth is restricted, but there are large parts of it that are quite sprawled and that are quite suburban. And I think one of the things that has helped London also is that people are already quite multimodal. And when people are already using public transport or walking for some trips, it's then easier to get them to consider cycling. That when people are sort of locked into 2 or more car households, it's really hard to get them to change. And that's, the fact that London provides a good public transport service. It's not cheap. It's quite expensive, but it is, apart from buses, but it is quite reliable. It does have good coverage. So I think having good conditions for all those different types of transport, and London has methods to restrict car use alongside methods to encourage alternatives. When the congestion charge was brought in the early 2000s in London, that money went into improving buses, making buses cheaper, safer, cleaner, a better bus service, and also improving conditions for people walking. It was also clearly making a difference to people who were using other types of transport, and buses are certainly well used by a wide range of people in London, particularly on lower incomes. So that was seen as quite important as well.
You've done, good amount of research in last so many years. You also have developed tool. So was there any finding in your research that really shocked you?
So I was quite shocked by the sheer amount of near misses that people were having. It was quite heartrending to read some of the accounts of people's experiences and to think we as a society are creating environments and we're asking people to cycle, and yet they're having these really quite horrible and unpleasant experiences while they're doing it. So that is what a negative example. But there's also a positive example, which is the ability of infrastructure interventions to get more walking, because I'd assumed that people were already walking quite a lot. I didn't think that I would necessarily find increases in walking, but I did find that changes to the street environment could increase levels of walking. So I thought that was quite interesting as well, that there is potential for a lot more walking. It doesn't necessarily come from car use, but it might just be more walking, more everyday walking, which I think is a good thing anyway, to have more people feeling like they can be out on the street, walking, going to the shops, and that they feel safe. So the high level of near misses, but also the potential for people to walk more, I think is two things that surprised me.
If you look 10 years ahead, what's the biggest transport issue no one is paying attention to right now?
So I think it depends on context, and I know most about is the London context. And one thing that we're not dealing with very well that is going to potentially become more of a problem is around goods deliveries. So London has been quite successful at improving people travelling, increasing the amount of sustainable travel that individuals do, people do, and reducing car use. But goods delivery is increasingly a problem, and it's quite hard to shift in terms of the way it's organised. It's also often a sector characterised by poor employment. People are treated very badly. There's a lot of app-based work, platforms and so on, which are people have really bad conditions of employment. People are kind of living on the margins. So the challenge of finding a solution to goods delivery that is delivery work that is environmentally sustainable but also socially just is a really big challenge. I think that's only going to get bigger.
That's true. So you worked in spaces where women are still underrepresented. Academia, policy, transport. So how has being a woman shaped the way your ideas were received?
It's interesting, and it's sort of always a little bit speculative, I guess. So things have changed quite a lot over the past 20 years when I've been working in this field. It's certainly become, the contribution of social science and disciplines has become clearer as well. But it's been, a little difficult in the early years, in particular going to conferences where I was quite junior, where it was mostly men presenting at the conferences, and kind of you feel nervous, you feel, if I mess this up, because I'm the only woman on this panel, and it's really uncomfortable experience. I think it was intimidating. I guess it made me more determined in a way that it was important to change that situation. It was important to try and create more inclusive environments, because clearly one of the problems with transport is the fact that in the UK, transport planners and engineers are drawn from a relatively restricted demographic, and certainly traditionally that has been largely men. So I think changing that, to ensuring that people of a wide range of backgrounds are involved in planning. For instance, I remember a story told by when someone called Andrew Gilligan was the cycling and walking commissioner, and he was starting to plan routes. He had an idea for a route that would go through a housing estate that would be great because it was away from motor traffic, so it would be safe from motor traffic. And he told the story of having gone through this route with two planners from Transport for London, and the two planners were women, and they both said, no, this route is terrible, we would not feel safe here after dark. So being women, they had a slightly different perspective on how they would have felt travelling that route, and that influenced the way that cycle route was planned. So having people of a range of backgrounds, perspectives, experiences is really important, to ensure that routes are not just built for white non-disabled men, for instance, that they suit a range of different groups.
What advice would you give to young people who want to change how their cities move?
Wow. I suppose one thing is thinking strategically and thinking where is the place that you can identify that you can make most change, because on any topic there's a whole load of different things you can do. You can exhaust yourself. It's completely possible to be burnt out from trying to change things in whatever field you're in. So I suppose identifying where there is the possibility of leverage, where some additional evidence, networking or action or whatever it is might make a difference. And I suppose for me, I began to figure out that London was the place where things were going to happen in terms of cycling, even though London had not been that promising for cycling in the past. That was where, due to governance, due to various changes going on, it seemed like things might start to change, and in particular around Transport for London doing some really quite interesting things. Transport for London, interestingly, does have quite a lot of women involved in planning and transport planning. So in some context, it might be around children being able to play freely on the streets. In some cases, it might be about older people's mobility, but there's always a context. You will know your context. What are the angles that you can take? What are the organisations that you can influence? And look after your own mental health, because some of this stuff can be quite difficult. It can be feeling out of place. Those things do take it out of you. So it's worth making sure you've got time to rest and recuperate as well.
That's such a thoughtful advice. Rachel, thank you for sharing your journey and your research with us today. From the hidden stories of women and children to the near misses that shape how safe we feel, to the potential revealed by tools like the Propensity to Cycle tool, your work shows us that fairer cities are possible, but only if we choose to design for people, not just for policy. So thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you, Ruchita.
To everyone listening, I hope this conversation sparks something in you. Cities thrive when people thrive. At the Human City, that's what we believe. If this episode moved you, please share it with someone who cares about building better cities. Subscribe on Spotify and YouTube so you can join us for more conversations like this. And send us your thoughts or guest suggestions at the given email ID. Thank you for being here, and until next time, keep imagining and building cities that put people first.